Hey everyone, hey everybody, it's me. I wanted to come on here and to talk about what's been going on lately with the George Floyd protest and all the violence and rioting we've seen lately. I'm old enough to remember the LA riots of 1992 after what happened with Rodney King and the verdicts that came down in that case. For those of you who may not know, Rodney King was beaten by some cops. The videotape got released into the public. The 4 officers were tried in Orange County, which is a conservative county. They found the 4 not guilty, and all hell broke loose in Los Angeles. If you want to know more about it, Google it, or even better, you look it up on YouTube. You can see the violence for yourself and what happened. The problem is, it's kind of like a double-edged sword. I understand why they're doing what they're doing, but it's almost playing into the hands of the people that are their worst enemies. The truth is that what happened with Mr. Floyd was a criminal act. Those officers were rightly fired, and those officers should be charged with murder and convicted. But this has been brewing for a long time. A very long time. There is a sense in this country by African Americans that no matter what happens, they're always going to be behind the 8 ball. They're going to be always second-class citizens. And they have every right to feel that way because the system we have right now does exactly just that to them. For those of you who deny it, for those of you who say that things are fair, you don't know what you're talking about. To be perfectly frank, I don't know what I'm talking about because I'm not African American. I'm white. I don't know what it's like. I'm not going to sit here and pretend, but I have some rough ideas of what it's like because I've listened to people who've had to go through that. And it ain't fun. It is probably one of the great sins of this country is slavery and what we've done after the Civil War to African Americans to keep them down. The second, in my opinion, is what we did to Native Americans, but I'll get to that at another time. We claim to be a free country. We claim to be all about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the truth of the matter is, it's only for a select few. And that's been that way for a long time. And what we've seen in the last few years is the reinforcement of this belief that only white males should be totally free or have the freedom, a feeling of freedom. That should never be true. There is no such thing as total and complete freedom for the individual. Because total and free, complete freedom for the individual means that you run the risk of other people's freedoms being infringed upon, including the ones of the individual. There is no such thing as total and complete freedom. You have a responsibility to society to respect the rights of others. That is something that should be as plain as the nose on your face. But for some reason in this country, we love to cut our own nose to spite our face. Many of you aren't as astute about history as I am. I'm not going to claim I'm some fancy historian or anything like that, but I've been a student of it for a while. I read up on it as much as I can. And I'm also a fan of science fiction. And science fiction is one of those things that a lot of people who don't know about it think science fiction is always predicting the future, but sometimes science fiction is showing you what you don't want to happen. And what we're seeing right now, not only in this country but around the world, is this move toward an autocratic order that reinforces old social beliefs that are essentially dying out. The idea of white supremacy should have died out a long time ago, but nevertheless it is continuing to persist with a figurative radioactive half-life that seems to be going on forever. The truth of the matter is, white supremacy has never been true. It is merely skin pigmentation. But in a cultural sense and in a political sense, it is more than ever true. It should be eradicated because it is inhibiting the country, it is inhibiting the world, it is inhibiting the human spirit as far as I'm concerned. Well, I can't agree with the rioting and the violence. I understand it, but to a degree also there has been evidence of showing that perhaps this isn't the work of the people who are protesting this death. I believe there is solid evidence that there are groups of white supremacist and radical right-wing groups, and to a certain extent maybe even these Antifa groups, anti-fascist groups that our dear beloved president claimed to be domestic terrorists yesterday and wanted to classify them as such. Funny he didn't mention the same thing about white supremacy, who have actually have a long history of conducting acts of domestic terrorism. And on that note about anti-fascist, if you're going to start calling anti-fascist domestic terrorism, well, guess what? You're calling every World War II veteran a domestic terrorist because they fought against fascism. What a lot of people don't understand about fascism is that it's not just about one man leading the nation. It's about the people who support him. Take a look at the definitions of fascism, and you'll take a look at what's going on in the country, and you'll see that we're getting perilously close to turning into one. It's scary. We all naively thought a long time ago that Trump would be not really that effective, that he would be controlled by the Republican Congress, and then the Republicans would get wise to him and boot him out 4 years later. Well, that's not come to pass because and it's not that Trump has been that effective, it's just that the people behind him have managed to make it to where he's been more effective than we ever feared. Hitler wasn't the real danger. There's in history this belief that if Hitler had been killed, that all would have been right. Killed early on, all would have been right. That was not the case. Someone else would have come along, perhaps someone else more sane, but still with the same beliefs as Hitler, that would have been much more effective and wouldn't have fallen for the traps Hitler fell, like invading Russia when he really didn't need to. There have been autocratic attempts, some that lasted for a long, long time, some that still last for right now, some that fell apart real soon. But no country like us has ever gone in that direction. That's had a sustained period of economic success like we've had. You look at China, their recent economic boom is only roughly 30 years old, 40 years old, around that era. Before that, they were third world. Look at Russia. They're still digging themselves out of the collapse of the Soviet Union almost 30 years ago now. They are, in a sense, some way of an economic power, but they're still trying to grow. They're bigger they're too big for their britches, to be perfectly frank. But they want to be too bigger for their britches. I think part of the problem here is that we are facing a campaign by Russia to undermine the country. Before you react saying that Donald Trump is behind this, that's only part of it. Have you ever heard of the phrase playing both sides against the middle? You take a look at Vladimir Putin, former KGB agent who's now the president of Russia, basically the de facto dictator of Russia. He has a long history with the KGB. There are people like him who are in positions of power who look back at the 90s when Russia was basically groveling at the feet of the United States in their view after the Soviet Union had collapsed, and they viewed this as a humiliation when in fact it was a necessary rebuilding of a collapsed political system that never had a chance to really survive because of the immense corruption that was taking place. Vladimir Putin wants to be a dictator. He wants to be an autocrat, and not just in Russia, but across the world. He has bold ambitions for Russia. But he's very crafty. He understands military might isn't going to get the job done, especially when China is around and when the United States is around. China he can do business with. The United States, not so easy. We are still, at least for now, an active democracy. And I only hesitate to say, at least for now, because of worrying concerns I have that people in positions of power, both in political and corporate levels, want to undermine that completely. There's a bigger game going on, ladies and gentlemen. A bigger game than even I, and many people like myself who study this stuff, and have studied this stuff for a long time, have been looking at. Corporate power has never been as great as it is right now. Corporations have immense political power across national borders. It's never been like that in human history. Not to this extent. The immense amount of abilities for major corporations to flex their political will is immense. It's shocking to see. And it's there. Only a fool would ignore it. And what is truly sad is that there are people who dignify this, who will go out of their way to act as if this isn't going on, when they know damn well it is going on. The protests we've seen are not just against a political system that has kept African Americans and other minorities down for 400 years. It's against a system that may very well be coming to this nation, that will undermine the political system that we built for nearly a quarter of a millennium. In 6 years' time, we celebrate our 250th anniversary of independence from Great Britain. For most of that time, we were a beacon of freedom. But it has not always been rosy. We have a checkered past. We don't like to admit it to ourselves. We don't like to admit that we've done things that aren't in the spirit of this country, that have violated our moral fiber, both foreign and domestic. And the sins have come home to roost, in my opinion. We have a great reckoning coming. I think this virus is part of it. This belief that the individual is superior to the group or the nation as a whole, when in fact the founders wanted a balance between the rights of the individual and the rights of the group and the nation as a whole. It's a precarious balance, a very difficult to maintain balance, but one that is necessary for a democracy like ours to flourish. And for most of our national history, it did balance to a certain degree, not entirely completely. But there was a time when things were looking like we might get to some sort of equality. The Civil Rights Bill of 1964 changed things dramatically for African Americans. And that shook the powers that were and are today. And that is why, for the last 4 or 5 decades, they've cemented themselves in the Republican Party. There is a rich white establishment that want to keep their political and economic power over this country. They're not just a bunch of racist rednecks. They are people with power, wealth, influence, and they want to maintain that. Not just over poor blacks and Hispanics and women, but also over poor whites. I could go into this more detail, but all you have to do is look at the history of this country the last 40 years and what average workers, I should say, not just white workers, but average workers across the board have gone through. We're the most productive we've ever been in our nation's history over the last 40 years. But if you look at the post-war to 1979 economic model of production and wage increases to what it's been after 1980, you'll notice wages have stagnated. There's a reason for that. Corporations and the rich elites have kept wages down intentionally. That's why someone who is making minimum wage doesn't have the buying power of someone that was making minimum wage in 1979. And even before that in 1969. The reason for that is we have a system of economics called trickle-down economics. This is supply-side economics. It was praised by many conservatives at the time, and still by some, as a way of raising up all boats, when in fact it's only raised up the rich and kept the poor drowning. The truth of the matter is, the poor don't want the rich to suffer. They just simply want a piece of the pie, bigger piece of the pie, to be able to survive and to have some pleasure in their life, to have some joy in their life, to where it's not just a drudgery until you die. If you studied history, you'll note at one time the tax rate on the rich was 91% in the 1950s by a president known as Dwight D. Eisenhower, a Republican. Back then, the political landscape was much more different than it is today. Republicans tended to be more moderate than conservative. There were even liberal Republicans. Democrats were not far right, far left wing. They were more middle of the road. You had conservative Democrats even. That all changed in the 1960s. After that Civil Rights Act I mentioned earlier, a lot of Southern Democrats moved to the Republican Party, and that's when the political polarization began. And there were people who took advantage of it for their own agendas. Agendas that, in many cases, conflict with the very heart and soul of this country, in my humble opinion. I could sit here and talk more about this, but the truth of the matter is it's not going to change much. We're going through a reckoning right now. maybe one of these days it'll change. That's it for now. I'll talk to you later.